Hi, everybody. Welcome to One Question, the podcast that brings together two Christians and a skeptic in conversation about the state of the world and what justice looks like in practice. Each episode returns to one core question. How do we move from words to action in ways that actually strengthen community? We unpack what's happening, name the forces behind it, and stay focused on what people can build together. My name's Matthew Brake. I'm your host. And joining me, as always, are Moki Masao.
Adieu. I bid you adieu. Is that? No, that's goodbye. Hello.
Much better. Stick to the English. The French might be tough. Might be tough for you.
I'll just stay with, hey, how you guys doing?
And then always mentioning him last because he is the skeptic and thus in the minority on this podcast. Haha, just kidding. Jason Bayless. Hey, there he is. How's it going, guys?
Well, last Friday I went to bed like I usually do on most nights, and I woke up on Saturday and we were at war, which does not happen on most Saturday mornings for me. So that was strange times, but otherwise good.
Okay. So other than that little pesky problem of war, things are normal otherwise.
Yeah, right.
Jason, what about you?
Same, similar. A lot of conversations about what the state of the world looks like and where we're headed is happening. Outside of that heaviness, life is good.
Yeah, it's amazing. Life is how you can find some sort of maybe livableness in life, even though there are things in the world that are chaotic and everything's going crazy.
Both can be true at the same time.
They can, absolutely. Well, thank you, those of you, I should say, who joined us for our last conversation. And so after our last podcast, Jason had some thoughts. So last time we had discussed basically how folks like Moki and I, believing people, specifically Christian believing people, are able to articulate a position that allows us to work for justice together with people outside of our faith tradition. For some of you, I realize that might not even be, you might not know why that's an important question. But for many in the Christian tradition, that is an important question because there is this idea that, because Christianity is the truth, those outside it lack any truth at all. So why should we even work with them? What do they have to say? 2 John tells us to avoid people who aren't a part of the faith, right? So we discussed stuff like that last time. But Jason, you had some follow-up thoughts there that you wanted to touch on regarding how Moki and I had talked about the work of real social justice as being God's work in the world that can be done by anybody. And God does not discriminate when it comes to people working for justice towards others in this world. The question of eternal salvation and those things, those are like a different conversation to have. But when it comes to our shared life in this world, we should be able to have the wisdom to recognize that there are those who work for justice in this world who aren't a part of what Christians in particular would view as a Christian Orthodox understanding of how the world and the universe works. So you had some follow-ups there. I want to let you go ahead and articulate some of the questions and thoughts you were having there.
I have no idea what you're talking about. No, I'm kidding. No, I think thanks for the moment to add these questions. I think from our conversation of episode 1, we were talking about the importance of, we talked about liberation. We kind of touched on liberation. We talked about how liberation looks different for each other. It looks different the way I view and what I need to feel like to be liberated from whatever oppressions or whatever systems, systemic natures that I'm involved in might be different than what you need. And within that, there was still the framing of our conversation is around the question around, is social justice work God's work? And I think that needs to be examined a little bit more before we can actually answer it, because I think it has potential to be problematic for both skeptic and Christian alike. I think it's potentially problematic for everybody. One reason why it's potentially problematic is because it doesn't matter if the answer is yes or no. Because if the answer is yes, God is affirmed. And if the answer is no, God still exists, but has different priorities. And what that does is it automatically, in that framing and that answer and that positioning, automatically removes somebody from the equation. And that somebody is somebody who has a different faith, or those who don't subscribe to religious teachings or applications. And the other aspect that it becomes problematic is either way, the divine is given, and whoever controls that given controls the conversation. And where that becomes public for everybody in the room is that if you can control the conversation and not have accountability within that, because you can't hold God accountable like you can hold humans accountable for their actions. So if you're giving that injecting the frame that the divine is given, then anybody can claim any action as divine. And we're seeing that happen right now, play out within our administration. We're seeing that happen right now in the war that our country has waged against multiple nations, not just Iran. And I think it was last week, the days blend together, but either last week or this week, a U.S. military commander told the troops who were deployed in Iran that, quote, this is all part of God's divine plan, that Trump has been anointed by Jesus to light the signal fire in Iran to cause Armageddon, end quote. So going back to what I was saying, when the divine is given and not challenged and not given the ability for us to question the authority within that, then those who follow have a hard time questioning it. And I see it show up now that there's a lot of Christians who because of this framing are stepping in and saying this is a just war. This is a just action. The things that this administration is doing is just because it follows in the footsteps of Christ or Jesus or whatever narrative that they bring forward. So let me pull it back to the question is like I think it needs to be re-examined in terms of how we frame is social justice work God's work, and what impact that actually has on us all, both in the good and the negative. In this case, I gave an example of a negative because I would love to say that it's an extreme case. It's a rare case scenario for the example, but history has shown that this shows up time and time again. And I think it's really important for us to explore this and talk about this and see how it lives for us. So I'll stop rambling now and give the space back to you.
Yeah, I'm just jotting some stuff down because I think there's a lot of good stuff to follow up in what you've articulated on. So I definitely have some thoughts I could say, but Moki, I wanted to know if you had any initial thoughts about what Jason has shared. I mean, I can go if you don't, but what would you say as our resident Bonhoeffer dude?
That's a very high and mighty title that I don't think I have. I think that Jason's...
Whatever you say, it's going to be better than Eric Metaxas. For those of you who don't understand the reference, he wrote a book on Bonhoeffer that real Bonhoeffer scholars have panned because he makes Bonhoeffer at times something he's not, which is an evangelical Christian. So continue.
So, and also Bonhoeffer's family also denounces that work. So that there's this added fuel to the fire. So the question with Bonhoeffer is, so I don't struggle with the notion of justice work is God's work, even with what's kind of going on with the current administration, and even just the way that it's used to essentially justify tyranny, justify, war, all these sorts of things. The thing is, I mean, when Bonhoeffer in his time, what he was struggling with was trying to understand, like, I think in many ways what we're trying to do here, even in this conversation, is how do we retrieve this notion that justice work is God's work, even when it looks like it's being used to the contrary. So that was his one thing.
You're saying with that in the context of Nazi Germany, when you had a good chunk of the German church trying to reconcile the Third Reich with Christianity, versus him in the confessing church trying to do something different. Yeah,
because he wasn't trying to say like, so his thing was in some ways, how do you make that like a legitimate claim that really does align with, what the Bible teaches? So, and he talks about, like ethical disintegration, and the way that he saw it was that ethical disintegration, basically someone like a commander of an army can say we're doing the work of Jesus by doing actions that are like completely contrary to what Jesus commands his people to do. I mean, and the thing about this, like, there's very clear things in the Bible. Like, for example, there's a verse that says, Jesus himself says, people will know you are my disciples by how you love one another. But then you have here this commander doing whatever he's doing, but they're not seeing the dissonance. And Bonhoeffer says that part of the main reason for that disintegration and being able to not be duped is simply by being intoxicated with power. And that intoxication leads to essentially like just delusion. So it's almost like they're brainwashed. It's just brainwashing, basically. That's like very general, like big paintbrush swath of that. Another thought I had, and this is something that really changed my views when I was in seminary, was I wrote a paper on, I learned about the slave Bible that was, that was done by slave masters in America back in those days. And it basically took out large portions of scripture that slave masters or whoever, they deemed that these would, ironically, these passages, whatever, would incite slaves to want freedom, to want more from their situation than anything. And so for me, ever since then, one of the things I've thought about is the story of the Exodus is probably one of the most famous stories in the whole Bible, and it was reclaimed by black enslaved people to legitimize their resistance to slavery in however ways they did it. The problem was that there just was no socioeconomic power behind what they were doing, so they couldn't really turn the tables in their situations per se. So the thoughts I have are really about that. A large part of this is the brainwashing aspect of it, and how that it sort of in a way like legitimizes the truth, because what you're seeing is not the truth. And the fact that the same story can be used powerfully as a sort of like an energizing mechanism by oppressed people are the two kind of, I wouldn't call it a given, but I think there are two kind of use cases for why the term can I could still wrestle with it and try and kind of think in those terms. But to Jason's point about like who controls the divine, I think is a great question. Yeah, and I think that the hard part about the way that I understand Christianity is that, like James Cone and all majority of black liberation theology, the notion of the divine is controlled by the oppressed God, which is counterintuitive to how it's being understood. Now, God has to be powerful. He has to be this just war kind of like warrior God who is smiting all his enemies and conquering the land for whatever it is he's supposed to be conquering for.
Well, it seems like your idea of God and what God is like, I mean, being informed by people like Bonhoeffer, being informed by the Black experience in America, I mean, that's a view of God that is inherently anti-empire, right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of like a hermeneutic that informs your understanding of God, and how we should understand what God wants. And when we're acting on God's behalf, are we against empire? Like that narrative of Egypt is God against empire. The narrative of Israel and Babylon is God against empire. And that informs so much of Black liberation theology's standpoint.
Yeah. And
right?
I mean, I was thinking about it over the last couple of weeks, like, so even just like the war with Iran, it's obvious it's tied to Israel and just this obsession we have with Israel and why. And I mean, I remember, way back in days when I was a younger guy reading, I think like a few pages of one book of the Left Behind series, so the whole pre-millennial stuff. At the time, it was so powerful and I was just so captivated. And then when I was older, I went to one of these large prayer houses, that like full on premillennial dispensationalists that kind of look at the Bible as like this like Da Vinci Code to like figure out when Jesus is coming back. So we're like kind of preparing for that, and how Israel is like this linchpin that we need to preserve Israel's integrity in some ways, like almost by any means necessary, because this is what Jesus needs to come back.
It's almost a form of, how, when you study politics, you read about left and right accelerationist views. Like leftists want to accelerate, in some ways, Bolshevism was an accelerationist view. Like, we don't have time for Marx's view of history to play out with the development of class consciousness and capitalism. Like, we're in a feudal Russia, like, let's accelerate this stuff. And then, of course, you have right-wing accelerationists who want a race war and things like that to re-inaugurate some sort of, fascist utopia. Is that an oxymoron? right? And so what you have with a number of Christians, particularly regarding how they view Israel in terms of eschatology, it's almost a form of Christian accelerationism, of premillennial accelerationism, if you want to
Yeah.
call it that, like hastening the end, you know, which I went to a Bible college that preached we need to do missionary work and make people Christians in various cultures. And once every culture has at least one convert, then the end will come. We accelerate the end. But this is a different form of that. This is something needs to happen geopolitically with Israel, and we can accelerate that happening. And we don't care how many men, women, and children we have to kill to get there, or what type of geopolitical instability we need to create, which could end up leaving a terrible world for our children and grandchildren. Because if our eschatology is wrong, or if like we're trying to play God in this to make stuff happen, and this isn't how it's going to go down, we're just leaving a more terrible world for our children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
Right. But the idea is this accelerationist drive, which I
Yeah.
think is a little nihilistic in some ways in terms of not really thinking nothing else matters. And so there's no need to preserve peace, even though Jesus calls us to be peacemakers. There's no need, right, to turn the other cheek because, I think as you pointed out, like Israel almost becomes, and its security defense, security interest become this excuse where everything else becomes excusable as long as it's subordinated to this interest.
Yes.
So it's almost like if violating human rights helps make something happen eschatologically with Israel, it's justified, which goes against everything about the very human rights framework, which itself is based in Christian moral principle.
Yeah.
Right. So that becomes an issue.
Yeah, I mean, and the two things about that whole thing that just to me are there's the accelerationist point of view. For me, there's also like an escapist point of view too, because in premillennial dispensationalism, before everything gets super bad, we're all going to get raptured. So when everything gets bad, before the world essentially goes to the hell in a handbasket, all the Christians get raptured, and then Jesus basically destroys the earth. So there's an escapist point of view, and then also it's the irony of being able of holding a view that assumes that we have some kind of, or human beings have some like pivotal role to play in Jesus' return, when even Jesus himself says no one knows when no one knows when the Son of Man will return except for the Father, which is a very strange like verse in itself, but at the same time, like the point is, like, don't, like, this is something that you should not be focused on. That's, because when you focus on, you have the wrong focus, it leads you in the wrong direction. And so, yeah, I'm like, I'm trying to even wonder if I'm answering your question, if this is even helpful to Jason, but it's sort of like getting a little bit more meta in some of the mechanisms that create this situation where people like a commander of an army can say we're doing the work of, or we're anointed by Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's needed context. I think, again, like, people are going to, part of that premillennial dispensationalist view ties into the modern state of Israel in a lot of ways. And that gets tied into those who bless Israel will be blessed. Those who curse it will be cursed, per the Genesis 12 promise to Abraham, which gets interpreted as support Israel no matter what, Israel can do no wrong. So everything becomes justified in the name of, well, if Israel does it, it's fine. So I'm not saying, well, there are a lot of things I am saying there and I'm not saying there. So let me pass, because there's another aspect. You talked about premillennialism, this belief that the end is coming soon. Christians will be saved from the worst of what happens at the end, and then there's a tribulation. Postmillennialism is also playing a weird role in terms of how a lot of evangelicals in the U.S. understand their role vis-a-vis politics. So before premillennialism, the dominant view was postmillennialism, particularly in the modern era, which sort of matches the zeitgeist of modernity, which saw the world as getting better and better through technology, reason, progress, and so forth. And so postmillennialism was a view within a lot of Protestant Christian circles that said, we can make the world better. And so you do have certain movements towards justice that advocate that. That does play a role to some extent in abolition movements, women's suffrage movements, the temperance movement, which in part was dealing with the problem of drunkenness and domestic abuse in the frontier, ideas about maybe even cleaning up human waste and like doing things to improve septic systems so that like people aren't dying of, these diseases from exposure to germs and stuff. Like you have this idea of making society better, which begins to get replaced by premillennialism. And so now society won't get better. There's no, the poor you'll always have with you. What matters is saving people and getting out of here. But that almost gets replaced by this neo-postmillennialism that thinks that you improve the world or accelerate Jesus's coming by getting people into power. This is where we get the Seven Mountains mandate, where Christians should be in charge of government, media, education, etc. They should be in charge in order to help Jesus come back, make the culture more symbolically Christian. But at the same time, you don't have that social improvement safety net element that the original postmillennialism had. So it's almost like this weird, it's like the worst form of postmillennialism, where it's like, let's be in charge, but we won't improve anything, right? We're going to bring about austerity and all these things that will make things better. So now it's just about having power over the culture, not necessarily about improving stuff that can be empirically verified as being better, right? So it's like this postmillennial nihilism, right?
Like Booker T. Washington's talented 10th.
That was Du Bois's.
The talented 10th. Just get a little bit, and then they're going to raise, kind of like the rising tide lifts all ships kind of thing. But it's just they just get there, and the rest of us just kind of watch them from a distance as they succeed.
Yeah, I think the point of modern postmillennialism, it's not even to improve society in ways that are like socioeconomic. It's to grab a hold of power in order to, I'm not even sure it's about using those positions to create converts anymore. I think it's about giving Christians the power over society to have a symbolically Christian society, even if the people in that society don't have genuine, I'm not even sure that that's the goal anymore. So it's like these worst aspects of premillennialism and postmillennialism put together, right? It's like accelerationist, power hungry, empty symbol seeking Christianity. Anyway, that was a lot of context, Jason. I do want to follow up because I feel like that's providing some thoughts from us about the meta context. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, because I want to address that first part of your question about the problem of someone claiming the divine, and what does that mean for people who aren't claiming the divine and are doing things for other than divine reasons? Like, are we controlling the narrative by claiming this is God's work? Or, but I wanted to see if you had any quick thoughts or comments about anything we shared.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts and comments, but let's round it off and then we'll pick it back up after you respond to this.
So I think you bring up an interesting point. I remember I was taking a class at Mason with, actually, Moki, Randy Rashcover.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I was taking a class with Dr. Rashcover, and we were reading, I think it was a class on secularity and religion in the public sphere. So how the secular and the religious engage in public dialogues and on what basis they engage in these dialogues in a secular arena. And I remember we read a piece, I think it was a dialogue between the former Pope Benedict back when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, and I think Jürgen Habermas, who's a big theorist in secular politics, who actually just died today. We're recording on the 14th. So Habermas he wasn't killed, he died. He was 96. And there's this piece that Ratzinger writes in dialogue with Habermas, and if you read it on the surface, it sounds like Ratzinger is saying, we can find some way to engage in dialogue for mutual benefit and mutual respect. But when you read below the surface of it, as Rashcover pointed out, that's not quite what Benedict or Ratzinger was saying. What Ratzinger seemed to be saying was sort of that if people are doing stuff, they're doing it for God's reasons, and they should come to see that the reason they're doing it are for God's reasons, or something like that. Like, Ratzinger was sounding like this was a mutual place between two different people, but it's actually a thing where he's basically still saying his own view is superior, right? And sort of defining the other in a way that the other wouldn't define themselves. And I think that sort of what, Jason, you're pointing out is that, like, it's one thing for if we say, like, hey, we're both engaged in these mutual projects, like, you're really doing God's work too. And that sort of puts us on the superior thing because we're defining it according to our own terms, which is what Ratzinger was kind of doing in that case. That's not quite what I would say we're doing, because I do think I recognize the problem. This is something that the theologian Karl Rahner has sort of been criticized for. He had this idea of anonymous Christians. So this idea that even if a person isn't Christian, if they're doing work that a Christian should be doing, they're anonymous Christians who are Christian without realizing it. And so I'm aware of the problem that comes from that. But I think we also need to realize that when we talk about people from different traditions doing justice work, like there are imminent reasons for people in different traditions. And I'm defining tradition broadly: religious traditions, political traditions, secular traditions. Like these are our traditions. This is Alistair McIntyre basically saying none of us start from zero. We all come with like some sort of influence, whether we are consciously or unconsciously aware of it. We are bringing traditions to the table that have their assumptions about what the world is like, that make claims about what the world is like. So for me as a Christian, what I would say is that I probably certainly have some robust metaphysical ideas about how the world works. But when I'm engaging in justice work, a lot of those robust metaphysical ideas are to justify my behavior and my engagement, while understanding that the other person is going to come from a place with their own traditions, views. All right. So this is how the interreligious dialogue works too. So if you look at Judaism, for instance, I remember again with our professor Rashkover, we read this book on Jewish Christian dialogue, and it's sort of like when religions engage in dialogue, they have to ask themselves, how can we justify this dialogue? Like, what are the shared things that we can touch on? And so for Judaism, it'll be in this one book, I think it was David Novak, talks about, was David Novak? I'm mixing up Novak, so hopefully I'm not mentioning a problematic Novak. But Novak was talking about how for Jewish people, their basis of dialogue is the Noahic covenant and the principles of the Noahic covenant. A big one of which is don't murder, right? Don't murder and don't commit idolatry. So that opens the place for Jews to engage in dialogue with Christians. So what you're doing when you're approaching someone who's from a different place is you need to find imminent reasons within your tradition for engaging, while realizing that that other person will have imminent reasons that are unique to their tradition, right? And then from that place of the reasons within your tradition, you're able to reach out and touch on commonalities with others. So when me and Moki were talking last week, I would say that was us talking about how a Christian would come up with imminent reasons within their own tradition for engaging with the other who doesn't share those traditions, right? I can think of something like in anarchism, for instance, right? Like, and I'm thinking about Emma Goldman here. There's this sense of once you remove the social and institutional barriers and hierarchies that those create, like human beings are naturally harmonious and cooperative. That's sort of Goldman's view of human nature. I think humans are capable of cooperation and harmonious living, but I still have a belief in sin where my picture of human nature is a little less rosy. I don't want to say rosy. That's dismissive. But I have a picture of human nature where there's always going to be this deep existential flaw that drives us to violence, competition, etc. So like, despite those differences, I will look for the ways in which we both touch base, and that becomes the basis on which we do work together. Understanding that I don't share some of your imminent reasons and you don't share some of mine. So the conversation last week was about the imminent reasons for Moki and I that we can extend outside of our own tradition, even though those reasons are much more for us than they are for you. One other thing, I would say that, how if the divine is given, well, I would say that one way people from different traditions hold each other accountable is by knowing what those traditions say and holding each other accountable for the ideas within the tradition. So for you, holding us accountable, you would be like, what the hell is this turning the other cheek thing if you're going to go to war then? Like, there are reasons within our traditions that make our positions intelligible, and thus we can be held accountable for them. And that's I mean, this is coming from McIntyre specifically, who I think he's still out. Did he die recently also? I can't remember, but so I'm sort of coming from a place where I'm adopting some of McIntyre's ideas here in terms of how I'm processing this.
There's a lot on the table, and I also want to kind of pull out that in the domain of accountability, and just to name real quick that, yeah, I can hold you accountable for a belief or an action, but that has no impact on us going to war. That has no impact on on the ripple effects that the majority voice, the loudest voice of the mainstream voice of an ideology, in this case Christianity, is putting out in the world. And accountability, for the most part, if you look at history in that domain, is always pushed back when you try to hold the crown or the government accountable for, the doctrine of manifest destiny, for slavery, for all the things that we can cherry pick and say these are horrible things, which they are horrible things, that were led by people who represented themselves as with a connection to God or connection to the divine. You can't hold that accountable because they're not going to receive it. They're like, well, you cannot hold the divine accountable. You cannot you cannot pull consent from the divine. That's the system that is the way it's set up. And let me back up and give you some definitions on what I mean by authority. Well, it looked like you're going to say something, so go ahead and say it, and then I'll rabbit hole the authority.
Mike, so the comments were in part responding to the how, dealing with that, like how a believer talks about social justice work as God's work. I fully understand that is not your own self-understanding of how that happens. That is an imminent reason within the believer's tradition that helps them go out from it. Fully understanding that, like, that won't be your imminent reason. I think that's a little bit of a separate question from, because that's just establishing that shared, like, us together being in the same place, knowing that me and Moki aren't saying, no, this is the real reason you're doing it. We both know that, when people have deep metaphysical frameworks based on their religious traditions, among other traditions, the thick metaphysical beliefs that religions have, I know are not self-evident to the person who doesn't hold to that tradition. Like, so I'm not going to act like this should be self-evident to you. And I realize that I'm making certain existential commitments in my beliefs that aren't self-evident to those who don't share them. And in some ways, these justifications are more for me than they are for making you have that self-understanding. So that would be, that's the part I want to address there. To the issue of holding others accountable who have power, I think we can certainly address that, but I wanted to address that first part first.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the pulling out the separation, because there are two things that are kind of being collapsed. There's what you just spoke about, and then there's what I'm trying to also bring out is that it's not a critique of faith that I'm bringing forward. It's a critique of how power operates when it wraps itself in the divine. And then going back to the first part, I think my reflections of what you were saying is, like, for me, as we even talked about in the first episode, that liberation is not something you believe in. It's something that you build. That, for me, comes from the idea that people have been building justice or liberation across every ideology, every faith, for every century. And that's happened with and without God in the equation. So I recognize that faith can be a motivation for social justice. That belief can be something that gets you out of the bed in the morning, that motivates you, that moves you. And that's real. That's real for people. In my questions, I'm not removing that as real, and that really matters.
And I didn't take it.
No, I know. I'm also just bringing also listeners who we have internal. We know each other, and people may listen different. So
Yeah,
I wanna acknowledge that this is not that critique. And so whatever brings you to social justice work, in my belief, that is you. That is yours. That is something that you own. That is your choice to act or not act. It is your decision to build or not build. And it's your willingness to take that risk. All of that is you. And I think that's might be the humanist or the pulling from the bucket of being an anarchist. That's how I view it. So I'm saying this because, as you're saying this, that you were sharing your reflections on, like, there's things that you are mentioning that you're not trying to project onto to me or to the skeptic, but it's to really ground yourself in your teachings and your stuff. And I think where my concern is, and with the question that we spoke about at the beginning about it being embedded in the divine, my concern is that when we do that, when we obscure the mechanisms, when we obscure the work with wrapping it in the divine or saying it's because of the divine, we actually erase people. We actually erase the work because there are specific human beings who made specific choices and that sometimes had great cost to their own liberty. And I just don't want the organizer and the people to be lost in that because a community took a risk to do something. And what we see often when we say that social justice work is God's work, what it does is it erases the work that people have done, and it becomes co-opted by the institution.
Yeah.
And that's the root of my question. And again, this is not to challenge faith, because I totally 100% recognize the motivation behind it. I see the value that people find in themselves when they claim a faith. I'm just not one of those people, and that's fine. I'm not trying to convert anybody on that. And so, again, splitting out, there's that aspect, the personal, the interpersonal, and when we talk about this topic, and then there's when great power wraps itself in the divine, of what that causes, of what that influences and the ripple effects that causes with both of us, both the believer and the skeptic. It has potential harm for us all. Anyway, I just wanted to give that context because I think it's important for us to know that this is the dialogue that we're trying to bring forward, not your idea's wrong or people with faith ideas are wrong, people without faith, whatever's wrong. I don't think there's in this conversation the right or wrong. I don't think it's a binary. I think the reason I brought it up is this is something that has happened throughout history repeatedly. I mean, we need to acknowledge it and set a different path. But I don't know if any of that made sense, so I'm going to stop talking.
Any thoughts here, Moke? Again, I always have some stuff written down, but
Yeah, well, Jason, that phrase of power wrapping itself in the divine is very helpful. I've never kind of thought to conceptualize it that way. And as you were talking, one of the things that came to my mind was what was that tweet that Trump put out on Christmas Day? Like they had some attack on some, I can't remember what it was or where it was. I think it was somewhere in Africa. They attacked because they were apparently some enemies of Christianity, whatever. And his message was, we will defend Christians basically anywhere in the world, by any means necessary. And the irony of that coming out on Christmas Day. And I remember, I don't follow any of this stuff, but I remember reading that whole thing and just being so confused because I'm like, this is such clearly propaganda. I mean, all of the elements of it were so elementary. I mean, it's like you're not even trying to hide at this point. You know what I mean? Like, you know what's going to rile the people up. You know what's going to get people excited. You know what's going to kind of agitate belief and agitate allegiance. And you can just do it on a whim. That event was just, to me, so man, it just was it was really disappointing to see, because just knowing that there are people when they that kind of thing will, we talk about at the beginning of the show, will get them to yes, I am doing God's work. Yes, we are accelerating, even that, taking that verse out of context, hasten the day of his return, and so the question becomes about, and when you talked earlier, talking about who holds the divine accountable, for me, I think I was conflating it and I was understanding it in this way of, in this case, who holds the people, institutions in power when they do certain things like this by claiming the divine to just do essentially whatever they want to do. And that to me is an interesting question. And I think more interesting than trying to, for me, ask who holds God accountable, because that's playing the apologetics game that doesn't get anywhere.
one thing about the holding the divine accountable, which I do realize where in a lot of ways what we're talking about, as Jason said, are people who wrap the divine around their own power. Which I feel like, the thinkers I'm reading, I feel like even as you say that, all I can think of is this book I just finished by Thomas Merton on peace in the post-Christian era. and the type of Christians who advocate and support mutually assured destruction or nuclear first strikes, and how he talks about how this is just some nihilistic power. I mean, there were actually so many quotes. I posted one on my Facebook the other day. I can't probably find it now, but Bonhoeffer talks about the problem of a warlike Christendom and how it might have the vagaries of Christian language around it, but it is absolutely just nationalistic power. And so I think there's an interesting dynamic there of talking about when people are using Christian symbolic language to so cynically drum up their own base. And then the question of holding God's self accountable, which it is interesting that even a number of people who grow up a certain way, or skeptics who think, well, if God says it, Christians, Jewish people, Muslims aren't allowed to question it. But, when you read actual Jewish scholars on the topic of how to relate to God, I'm thinking of Heschel, or even like modern open theologians who recognize that when you look at the Bible, it is not don't even think about it and just do what God says. Like there is a yelling at God, there is lament, there is how long are you going to make me fucking wait for justice to break the yoke of the oppressor? There is Moses saying, standing before God whose temper is getting away from him, and he goes, I'm just going to destroy these people because I've helped them this much, and what the hell? And Moses is like, please don't. And God gets surprised and changes God's mind. So there is a dialogical element to the divine human relationship. There is a call response. There is, God speaking over the person who's getting punished or whatever, and then that person getting to speak back. And that's something that you see in the text, and I think could be practiced, right? So I think
could you tease that out a bit? I hear what you're saying, and the distinction here that makes it where I'm like, oh, this hurts my brain. The text, there's a two-way conversation happening, or it's replicated as a two-way conversation.
Yeah.
Today, there's not a two-way conversation. There's not a scene conversation that's happened where you can go, I withdraw my consent, or where you're actually challenging God, where he can change his mind or their mind.
Yeah. Well, I think the issue that I think a good model for this is actually in Judaism, because for Judaism, the conversation doesn't continue. There's a wrestling with the text in the entire discourse around the text, in the jurisprudence around the text. There is not the blind sort of subservient obedience in the Jewish tradition. Like it's still a dialogue, even if it's with other rabbis disagreeing what the text means. And so and I think there's a sense in which God is understood as being present within the community. So even the community's own discerning of how a text applies is the place in which we are in part putting into practice that pushback, that response, right? I think it's a little harder to do in like high church settings because so much of Christianity, particularly post-Constantine, but even before, has this Romanized model of the paterfamilias at the top, who's like the ultimate authority, and like you fall in line. But even in that tradition, there's the idea that God might still be present when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, or when the cardinals come up with something. There's this continual sense of God. I mean, Pentecostals do this all the time, where God still speaks through prophetic utterances, right? So there actually are robust traditions of continuing to talk of God's voice being present through the discerning of the community, but also maybe through, the echo of the voice through the later rabbinic discussions that happen. So I think there's still elements in there where things are wrestled with, and maybe that's where we might see that response element still of a teasing out.
But doesn't that lead to what we're seeing with what that military general or was it person said about the divine work of going to war? Because that could essentially be saying, well, that's the community within this same community who believes in the things that you were talking about earlier about, progressing Judgment Day, progressing the end times. Within that community, that's their sole purpose. So the voice of God, the way it's interpreted, is always going to be catering that domain and nothing outside of that domain.
Well, and I think most theologians would, like, a lot of denominations will have different guidelines, right? Like in some ways there are checks and balances, because some of this is about discerning, like, how does this principle we read here apply now? You know, and there are certain foundational, like the text is going to be a foundational thing you can use, as well as the traditions around the text, right? There is the reality that we learn new things about the world, and that should be taken into account if all truth is God's truth. You know, the experiences we have are not irrelevant. In fact, you could really say that before there was scripture, there were people's experiences with something they took to be divine, right? There is the foundational text of scripture, but there's also the community itself, right? So all these things in some ways are holding certain checks up, right? Like,
Can I make just a side haha?
Sure.
Remember what you said about Emma Goldman, about the belief being rose colored? I forget the exact phrase you said. Very similar to what I'm hearing now from you about
it's messy.
the potential.
Oh, no, the potential can go sideways. And that's why in our show notes, I mentioned, like, when we talk religion, like in general, you know, Habermas, who's the great secular theorist, even Habermas will end up saying, like, he sees a value in religion. And Jason, you made a comment earlier that sounded like Habermas, that, you know, that religious reasons, that sense of that which cries out to heaven, as he writes about, in awareness of what is missing, that motivates people in a way that stark, cold Enlightenment reason can never do. Now, what Habermas will say is religion needs to translate itself into secular reasons that can be accepted by everyone, right? And that creates problems because, again, you're imposing a secular framework on those who aren't secular. So then you have people like one of our, I don't know if you actually had him, Moki, Abdulaziz Sachedina, who talks about human rights in the Islamic world. And one reason for not accepting the human rights framework is because it's a secular framework being imposed. Mm-hmm. So it's like a form of neocolonialism. So what Sachedina does is say, can't you just come to the same conclusions using Islamic resources and jurisprudence to do it, right? And so you find, again, going back to imminent reasons, right? But to that wider point, there is a problem, as you point out, with religion, which is what has often been called the ambivalence of the sacred. And this is something Karen Armstrong deals with in her book, Fields of Blood, which is worth reading, about how the sacred, you know, its ambivalence is found in that the sacred can lead to things that are liberating and life-affirming, and that should be celebrated. And the sacred and people's response to it can also lead to things that are unhealthy and terrible and violent and oppressive. So I'm not going to sit here and say that religion unequivocally leads to good, because it doesn't. Nor will I say that the messiness of community discernment processes always leads to good. And so I will admit that there's no guarantee here that a community's discernment process will go in a way that I think is healthy. You know, and this is where, for me, the Kierkegaardian leap of faith comes in, where I could probably argue two ways on most issues, but at some point you look at one stance and then another stance and go, you pull a Martin Luther, here I stand, I can do I can do nothing else, right? And so that is where that existential choice to be like, no, this is the way that leads to life over here. This other way leads to death. And I'm pretty sure violates not only my own moral intuitions, but things that I think are true within my own tradition as well. So I will totally get that it's messy. So I fully acknowledge that.
Yeah. I don't think there's an ideology, belief, lack thereof, or whatever that's not messy. I think at the end of the day, we're all trying to figure something out, trying to figure out how to live the best life possible and to share that best life possible with those who are around us. I think oversimplification of it, but I think there's a variant of that in everybody, regardless of belief or not.
Jason, really quick, I'm gonna just one quick thing. Just while you said that was really helpful, also, and I think when I think about the sort of like these dominant interpretations of the Bible or Christianity or theology that lead to sort of this like nationalism, maybe they call it radicalism. I think part of that comes from this like attitude of there's nothing to figure out. Like it's all obvious, and the obvious thing is to take the land. The obvious thing is to, you know, like everything is obvious, and there's there's no wrestling. There's no like, you know, uncertainty, you know, and like I was reading a review of Bonhoeffer's The Angel Studios Bonhoeffer movie, and one of the critiques was that in the movie Bonhoeffer like never deliberates about anything. He just like good is like, oh, this is clearly good, this is clearly bad, and it's up to y'all. Like, why haven't y'all figured it out yet? And it's so obvious to him and not obvious to everybody else. Where the real man struggled intensely with even the ethical decisions that he was making because they were difficult, especially when they deviated from the commandments, deviated from the command to love. And so that I just wanted to point out, just because that was a really nice way of I think articulating what both from us like on a religious side and you from the non-religious side are doing. Like, we're really trying hard to understand what's the path forward. How do we understand the paths that led us here, and how to move forward. And the alternative to that is when there's nothing left to figure out and all we have to do is just go and just like usurp, then you end up with what we're seeing today.
Yeah, actually, to that point, this is, one of the, if you know me, you know that one of the philosophers I've studied the most is Soren Kierkegaard, or Kierkegaard, if you want to be fancy, but we won't be. Kierkegaard's big thing, among other things, is what's popularly called the leap of faith. But this idea that we find in Fear and Trembling, where actually leap of faith isn't mentioned there. Sorry, nerdy, got to be nuanced here. But in Fear and Trembling, it's this idea of Abraham. It's wrestling with faith and ethics, right? That Abraham feels like God is telling him to sacrifice his son, but that goes against the ethical norm of being a good father and not murdering his son, right? And so it's like, what do you do when what God commands you overrides what's socially communicable in terms of ethical behavior? What people will sometimes take with that story is like, well, Kierkegaard is basically giving a justification of like 9/11. Sure, it's unethical to kill a bunch of combatants in the World Trade Center, but like I have this thing with God that lets me override what's understood as common decency and ethical behavior, so it justifies everything. And I think really any type of fundamentalist violence can be justified this way. But I think the thing that gets missed in the faith Kierkegaard is describing versus something like what we'd see on 9/11, or this idea of like, it's the obviousness. Because Kierkegaard's whole idea is that, the reason it's called Fear and Trembling is because it should fucking terrify you. Osama bin Laden and his folks were not terrified. It was obvious to them. They didn't trust with trepidation. They knew. Because fundamentalism by its very nature is foundationalist. It rests on a certainty of knowledge, right? And so I think that that's one thing that differentiates the type of faith I would describe from the justifications of the violent fundamentalist. Is like, they're not fucking terrified. It's so obvious to them. Like these guys who are talking about, well, this is all part of Jesus's plan to bomb Iran. It's so obvious to them. And the whole point of faith is that sometimes it might not be communicable, but like you're still called to act, and it should fucking terrify you. Now, for Kierkegaard later on, there's a lot of stuff that's happening in Fear and Trembling, and he's dealing with Hegel and all this other stuff. For Kierkegaard, it's very obvious that the God-man, Jesus, is the example of what Christianity should be. And he says in his attack on Christendom that anytime Christianity wraps itself in power, it's no longer viable. Like, it's not the thing anymore, right? So whatever Kierkegaard's idea of faith should be, it doesn't involve wrapping yourself in power and making statements that you act like are obvious.
Sorry, Jason, that was a massive derailment from what you were saying. I just had to point out, but nevertheless, I digress.
Anyway, sorry, I'm done. Continue.
No. Yeah, I'm trying not to rabbit hole the idea, though. Again, it's even in that, it still pushes me the question around who controls the divine, who says what is so. And I know that's so cliche in terms of when skeptics and believers are in a conversation. It always comes down to similar questions to that. So I don't really want to rabbit hole that, but I just also want to say it does push that question.
Do we want to address the question about what happens when power wraps itself in the divine. Do we want to move to that?
Well, I think that's where that pushes the question is like, who decides? And I think because the absence of that answer allows anyone to step into that space. And that's when power can easily wrap itself in the divine.
Sure. I have a thought here. I think any type of existential commitment, you're not going to find foundation for. Like, we're all sort of committing in the face of uncertainty, right? So I think about so I just started reading Walter Brueggemann's Prophetic Imagination. I actually can't believe I'd never read it before. But one of the things he talks about is sort of the prophetic confrontation with power, and how in the prophets you basically see these prophets who are probably a part of communities that are pushing against other communities, again within Israel, Judah, both understanding themselves as people of God, right? Both having access, let's put some historical critical stuff aside for now, both having access to the same traditions and scriptures and coming to radically different places in it. And how you have this prophetic critique coming up and condemning the royal kings of Israel and Judah, who are in part wrapped in the divine. Like, they, unlike Trump, they've actually been anointed by prophets, and their lines have been anointed by prophets to carry on. And there is this idea that, like, well, because we're the royals of the people of God, that means we'll always win. That means we're always right. That means we're at times untouchable. Like, we won't fall because we're God's people. And the prophets come along and say, no, you're still accountable for justice. You're still doing wrong because you're adding field to field and leaving nothing for everyone else. You're still unjust because this field belonged to this guy and you did a conspiracy to kill him so that you could take the field. You're going to war when you shouldn't be, and now you just want to listen to advisors who will tell you what to think that you want to hear, but actually there's condemnation here for doing that. And so there you see this sort of intra conflict between these prophetic voices that call back to these foundational principles of justice and equity, ending of oppression, and the royal consciousness that has wrapped itself in power and has blinded itself to the true spirit of what it means to do justice, right? And so you have these conflictual traditions even within the text itself, right? Like, the biblical text itself is filled with traditions that really elevate kingship and talk about the specialness of God's chosen people. And then you have these traditions that say it doesn't matter if you're chosen. Like, being chosen doesn't exempt you from the call to justice, particularly in these prophetic texts. And so if I were to look at something like what Trump is doing with the war in Iran, I would do a few things. It's like, number one, just because you're wrapping yourself in the mask of the divine doesn't mean there aren't problems here. I would look at, that the early church condemned the idea that anything good could be done for God's kingdom through the military, right? Just carte blanche across the board, right? That matters. That history matters. The fact that the master of our tradition, Jesus, or the words we have in the Gospels, condemn violence, like, that matters. And so that sort of carries on that tradition of other believing people within the community critiquing power wrapped in the divine, right? And that's always a tension you see in the text, in the kings of Israel and Judah, in the prophetic tradition. That doesn't go away. Like, people will always wrap up their power in the divine. I'm just thankful that there's precedence in the tradition for someone to come and be able to critique those things.
One question, so not one question, but something that after the last episode in the last couple weeks, took a look at Jason, your radical guide, and some of the stories and communities that you guys, some of like the listings that you have, and just all around the world. And to me, it was such an eye opener. Like, these are things that I never would have imagined were happening, and some of them were just so powerful. The one that stood out to me the most was, I think it's that one community in Barcelona. I think they do it was one where they get all the food that restaurants are going to throw away, and then they set up shop in a park and give the food away for free. So one way out, which is, I guess, not very obvious, but one way I would address the question of how do you hold the divine, who controls the divine, or even this narrative when it looks like power wraps itself up into it. Coming from the faith tradition within the faith tradition, part of what I would do is I would do things like this. where I seek out, like, learning from you and the Radical Guide and all these other communities that, I don't know if they're religious or not, are doing the things that, and this, like, now, like, thinking about like imminent reasons, like, for me, it's like, oh, this is what an example, a living example that's happening in real time of what the text is supposed to be saying. And going to the community, to my community, and saying, this is the work that we need to be doing. And what we're seeing now is not, I would even, man, like, I just go back to that joint on Christmas Day. That really messed me up. I would send a letter to my congregation father pastor and say, this happened. This is not it. This is it. And it's coming from people that are outside our tradition. We need to do more of this and not this. But it would be really a kind of a calling, it's kind of speaking truth to power, but mainly also doing it in the communities that I would have some kind of influence in, to try and paint a picture with real life and real communities, real action, real impact, and say, how are we doing this in our community here with the resources we have? And, try and, like Paul says, if I can just save some, then, so that would be it. It's really like more of like on a grassroots level, rather than maybe having the same influence as the power that's wrapping itself up.
Yeah, even Brueggemann, I was just reading the end of his second preface here. He's like, truthfully, like, there isn't the type of church power and culture for the type of, because what was happening with the prophets is they're representing probably these other constituencies within Israel and Judah, speaking on their behalf, representing them. And, once upon a time in American history, you might have gotten that where it's like, particularly the mainline denominations, you had people like Niebuhr, and then eventually, MLK and like all these other figures, but definitely more so within evangelicalism, because evangelicalism has always been more insular, particularly in the 20th century. But, because the main line is dying, you don't necessarily have those same voices anymore that are as powerful, as well known, speaking truth to power. So Brueggemann actually makes a similar comment to Moki, that the way we instantiate this stuff is in our local communities. Not that there might not be a place for trying to get some letter to the editor out there to critique power, but the way to do it is to instantiate justice in the communities we're touching, which I think something like what Moki was saying per Radical Guide is probably a bit closer to maybe what Brueggemann has in mind.
Yeah, I think to kind of pull that out of going to the community aspect of it, I attended, when I lived in the Oakland area, I attended an anniversary celebration of the Black Panther Party. And at that event, one of the speakers was talking about our leverage of strength, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact language, but it resonated with me because it tapped into something that I already knew was true, but it wasn't elevated up. And they said that our work is not in the White House. Our work is not in the DC. Our work is here in these streets with this community. And they're saying the people far away pulling the levers don't care about us. They never cared about us. And so when we speak truth to that power, it falls on deaf ears. Our strength is here in this community with these people that are here with us today. I knew that to be true, but it never elevated until I heard it being spoken. And going back to what you were saying about a Radical Guide, that is one of the functions of a Radical Guide is to not put pressure and create change in that system that we are taught to put pressure and create change in. Is to create a different system that makes that system that doesn't listen to us and doesn't value us obsolete, irrelevant. That we are building something so grand and together, and we learn from each other in that aspect and in that work, that we create something that makes this oppressive nature, the system that caters to a specific class, obsolete. And that's a long game. That's not going to happen overnight. But I think the reason I bring it up now is not just because y'all mentioned a Radical Guide, but I think it points to why we're having this conversation, why we are trying to look at that divide that we kept collapsing, the divide between us, the community, versus the national and international systems of power. I think that happens so much that we collapse those two to be one and the same. And when we do that, we lose sight of our own agency in that, our own strength, our own collective strength, not individual. And even in this conversation, we kept collapsing it and we kept pulling it back out and trying to figure it out. I think that struggle right there is really, really beneficial for everybody to be into, because once we can separate it, once we can identify it, this goes back to those labels, and we're able to label it and say, well, this is what that represents. How do we change it? What do we like about it? What do we not like about it? What do we collectively want to change about it? How do we make it obsolete? And the folks that you spoke about, that you saw in our directory of folks taking food that was going to be disposed of and returning it back to the community free of charge, that happens everywhere. And that's something everybody can do to start engaging with the community, be in conversation around what's needed now that our bellies are full. What's the next step? How do we make this the system? How do we make this the norm? And that actually we're building that structure that way. And I think the church, for the most part, has historically played a large role in that. We had the Catholic workers. We've had, kitchens, there is that work. And I think we're at a point now where we have to break through the wall that's holding that back as well, because we get trapped in what we talked about last time in episode 1, the charity mindset. We're now seeing the time that we have to break that wall and open it up into a different mindset, continue doing the work, but expand it to venture into new thought processes, new frontiers, and the way that we work and act together. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking.
So just a quick anecdote about that too is because I've been thinking the goal of this is action. The goal of this is to make something happen at the community level. And so when I read the stories on Radical Guide, my thought is, well, man, like, how am I gonna, if it's possible there, like, what could I do here? And, so I'm now like my mind is now racing and thinking about, okay, there's a lot of things we could do to instantiate justice. So anyways, I was driving around in my neighborhood doing DoorDash the other day, and went to a restaurant, and they just waiting for this order to get through, and it says there's a sign there on printer paper saying day old bread $1, and I'm thinking y'all are gonna throw this out anyway. Yeah, so it's that whole thing, like this, you're gonna throw it out, give it away. Like no one's gonna go to a sandwich shop and buy day old, like that's just so like. Prior to these conversations, I would have never seen that sign and say, wait a minute, that's a problem. And to me, like, I was like, oh man, like, so I appreciated the conversation we had, because it's got my mind thinking or seeing things a little bit differently that are all like in plain sight to me. I just have not had the expansiveness to be able to see them as problematic.
Cool. Any
yeah, that was not going anywhere. It just was. I just wanted it. I was like, yeah, let me just tell you the story. And the story was the point.
And I appreciate it. And also, silence is a good thing. We don't always have to fill the space, so we can sit with what you shared. And I appreciate
That's true.
it.
We know that podcast audiences like nothing more than sitting through silence.
We're not doing it for them. Nobody listens anyway. We're doing it for
That's fair. Well, 90 views so far, 90 views, but
Yeah.
that could just be every time we're clicking on to see what. All right. Any final comments or thoughts here? I feel like we covered a lot of ground today. A lot of potential avenues we could open up for future conversation or follow up. But any just final thoughts here?
Today was a struggle, but it was in a good way. Really learned a lot. So this is good.
Well, I think to stay true to the one question of like, how do we move words to action? I think we started touching on the action aspect of it, of what we can do. How can we, for me to put a fine point on that is like, if anything in this episode sparked curiosity and inspiration to look at your world differently, let us know in the comments of what shows up differently for you based on this conversation. Or if nothing changed, also let us know what that looks like, because again, yes, this podcast and these episodes started with the three of us wanting to have these conversations, but you're also the listener are also part of this conversation. So please leave the comments. Let us know what you think, what you like, what you dislike, what you see differently, what you see the same, where you see what we got right and what we got wrong. It's all welcome, because it helps us broaden our worldview in terms of what we can bring in terms of the content for these episodes.
Yeah. And on that note, we would love to hear from you. So you can obviously write in the comments. We also have an email you can write to, and we're sort of looking forward to getting any, I don't want to say that the hate mail would be more fun, but we're looking forward to any emails. You can reach us at onequestionpodcast1q@gmail.com, and that will be in our show notes. But again, that is all one word, onequestionpodcast, the number 1, the letter q@gmail.com. So, as always, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.
See ya.
Bye.
Stuff.